You and the president have vocally said it. And to be clear,
wrong.
your State Department on the morning of October 7th sent out a tweet telling Israel not to engage in military retaliation. I called you out at 3 in the morning, and you deleted that tweet. The next day, you personally on October 8th sent a tweet saying you'd spoken with the Turkish foreign minister and Israel should not retaliate. From the very beginning, the Biden administration has consistently at every stage told Israel, and by the way, when I called your tweet out, you deleted it again. At every stage, you have been telling Israel, do not kill the terrorist, and that has been Cruz. From day one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator.
Mr. Secretary, you have presided over the worst foreign policy disaster of modern times. When Joe Biden became president, he inherited peace and prosperity in the world. We now have 2 simultaneous wars waging, the worst war in Europe since World War II and the worst war in the Middle East in 50 years. Both, I believe, were caused by this administration's consistent weakness. And indeed, your foreign policy is precisely backwards from what a rational American foreign policy should be. To our friends and allies, this administration has consistently undermined, weakened, and attacked them. And to our enemies, this administration has shown constant appeasement and indeed has flowed billions of dollars to the enemies of America who want to kill us. Senator Barrasso asked you about Ibrahim Raisi. Your State Department put out a statement sending condolences for his death. Mr. Secretary, is the world better today now that Raisi is dead?
Given the horrible acts that he engaged in, both as a judge and as president, to the extent he can no longer engage in them, yes, the Iranian people are probably better off.
You didn't say that in your statement, did you?
I believe that we did. And certainly our spokesperson...
Today, the United Nations is flying their flag at half-staff to mourn the death. Would you agree that it is utterly disgraceful for the United Nations to be mourning the deaths of the butcher of Tehran?
We're certainly not mourning his death. As I said, we expressed...
Would you agree it's disgraceful for the UN to be?
I'll look at what they've done. We certainly would not do that.
What they've done is flown the flag at half-staff. Is that disgraceful?
We wouldn't do that, and we would certainly find that...
And I would note that's the absence of American leadership. All right, let's shift. The Washington Post on May 11th wrote an article. I'm going to read the opening paragraph. The Biden administration, working urgently to stave off a full-scale Israeli invasion of Rafah, is offering Israel valuable assistance in an effort to persuade it to hold back, including sensitive intelligence to help the Israeli military pinpoint the location of Hamas leaders and find the group's hidden tunnels, according to 4 people familiar with the U.S. offers. Is that paragraph accurate?
Exactly the opposite. First of all, no one has done more to defend Israel than Joe Biden.
Is that paragraph accurate?
Let me finish, if I may, please. He was there right after.
I'm not interested in a campaign speech. I have limited time. Is the paragraph in the Washington Post accurate?
As you read it, no. To the contrary, we're providing everything we possibly can to Israel to help them find.
So the 4 sources that briefed the Post, and by the way, briefed multiple other media outlets, they were lying?
Absolutely.
So, all right, so that, did the administration offer to provide the locations of senior Hamas leaders to Israel if they didn't invade Rafah?
That's, again, totally misleading and wrong. Here's what we've said, and here's what we're doing. We have said that there is a better way to deal with the challenge that...
I'm not interested in the speech.
If you don't want to hear my answer...
Did you offer the location of senior Hamas officials if they didn't invade Rafah? That's a yes or no?
If we had the locations, of course we'd provide them, irrespective.
So this statement, you're saying the Post got it totally wrong, it is utterly false, and anyone who said to the contrary was lying and perjuring themselves if they were under oath.
That statement is incorrect. We have done and will continue to do everything we can to, if we can do it, develop the information and share the information. I wish we had it.
Does the administration have intelligence on the locations of Hamas officials that you have not shared with Israel?
No.
Does the administration have the locations of Hamas terror tunnels that you have not shared with Israel?
No.
Okay, so then your position is that this story is an utter and complete lie.
As you've read it to me, Senator, it's not. It is not accurate.
And we're not interested in playing word games. I've asked you very directly.
I have not.
So you're saying there's not a single Hamas leader that you know about, that you or the administration has offered, will tell you where they are if you don't invade
That is correct.
Rafah. What have you offered them not to invade Rafah?
We've offered them nothing not to invade Rafah except a plan to deal more effectively with Rafah.
Okay, so
to
your
deal with their
testimony
enduring
under
problems.
oath is you've offered them nothing not to invade Rafah. I find that very hard to believe, but I just want to understand what your testimony is.
I'll be very clear. We have told them, we've been engaged in a long conversation with them about the most effective way to deal with the problem we agree must be dealt with.
They
That
are
is
quite
Hamas
aware
and
you
Rafah.
disagree with their plan to kill the Hamas terrorists because
That's
you and the
absolutely-
president have vocally
that is
said it. And to be
absolutely
clear,
wrong.
your State Department on the morning of October 7th sent out a tweet telling Israel not to engage in military retaliation. I called you out at 3 in the morning and you deleted that tweet. The next day, you personally on October 8th sent a tweet saying you'd spoken with the Turkish foreign minister and Israel should not retaliate. From the very beginning, the Biden administration has consistently at every stage told Israel, and by the way, when I called your tweet out, you deleted it again. At every stage, you have been telling Israel, do not kill the terrorists, and that has been from day one.
Senator, I was in Israel 5 days after October 7th. I've been there 7 times since. No one, starting with President Biden, has done more to make sure they have what they need to defend themselves from Hamas, to deal with the threat that Hamas poses.
With all due respect, that is ludicrous. That is ludicrous. Why have you cut off weapons to Israel then?
We have not cut off weapons to Israel. In fact, as you know well, starting many years ago, President Biden was at the heart of the MOU that led to Israel having a 10-year guaranteed supply of assistance. When you became
Secretary of State, how much oil was Iran selling a day?
I'll have to come back to you on any numbers. I don't have the numbers.
You don't know. It doesn't surprise me you don't know. It was about 300,000. How much oil is Iran selling today?
We've applied sanctions against more than 200 entities that are engaged in petrochemicals.
How much oil?
You can tell me. I'm sure.
Don't
I'm sure you know.
filibuster.
I'm not filibustering.
How much oil are they selling today? Do you know?
You tell me.
Apparently you don't know. So you don't know how much they were selling. It was 300,000. Today they're selling about 2 million barrels a day. Let me ask you.
And given the sanctions, given the export controls, given the other controls we put on, the cost of doing that, the evasion that they have to engage in, which we're trying to cut off.
They've made about $80 billion. Let me ask you another question. I'm running out of time, so I'm not interested in speeches. Let me ask you this. How many Ghost Fleet ships did Iran have in November 2020?
We have sanctioned more than 200
It's a question.
of those.
I'm not. How many did they have?
The total number, I can't tell you what it had in 2021. I'll come back to you with that, but we have...
the number was about 70.
Yeah,
how many do they have today?
We blocked about 50 of them.
Okay, let's see how effective you are. How many do they have today?
As I said, we blocked about 50
How many do they have today?
You tell me, I'm sure you...
They have about over 400. Look, this administration desperately wants a new Iran deal. You have been showering cash on Iran from day one. And understand, the $6 billion you were asked about is the tip of the iceberg. By refusing to enforce oil sanctions, we have seen Iran's oil sales go from 300,000 barrels a day when you got into office to over 2 million barrels a day today. That's $80 billion. 90% of Hamas's funding comes from Iran in a very real sense. This administration, you and President Biden, funded the October 7th attacks by flowing $100 billion to a homicidal, genocidal regime that funded those attacks.
That statement is profoundly wrong.
Why?
I'm not even going to humor it. I think it's a disgraceful statement.
Why?
We have gone at Iran repeatedly with more than 600 sanctions applied against different persons.
Then why are they
entities,
selling 2 million barrels a
200.
day as compared to 300,000?
They are working hard to do what they can to get around the sanctions.
So just the prior administration had tools you didn't have, they were more effective, or maybe they just weren't desperate to cut a deal with Iran.
And we continue every single day to go at them.
You are refusing to address the facts.
I'm not.
Then why are they selling 2 million barrels a day?
Because they're determined to try to do that. We're determined to cut them off.
They weren't determined when Trump was president?
They were determined. And, of course, unfortunately, we also had their nuclear program in a box. No fissile material being produced.
Okay, you're not answering the question. You're filibustering another topic.
Senator Cruz, you get the last word. You get the last word. If you like.
You funded our enemies and you undermine our friends, and the world is much, much more dangerous as a result, and Americans are at greater jeopardy because...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I applaud your and the President's efforts to condemn Hamas's invasion on October 7th, to secure a ceasefire, and to secure the release of hostages. President Biden has also recognized, however, that the campaign carried out by the Netanyahu government in Gaza has included what the President's called indiscriminate bombing, resulted in a massive number of civilian casualties. The NSM-20 report concluded, and I quote, "Given Israel's significant reliance on U.S.-made defense articles, it's reasonable to assess that Israel has used U.S.-provided weapons in instances inconsistent with international humanitarian law." Given this assessment, why did the State Department conclude that Israel's assurances that it was not using weapons in a manner inconsistent with international law are in fact credible and reliable?
Thank you, Senator. We've said two things from day one since October 7th. One, that Israel not only has the right, it has the obligation to defend itself and to try to make sure that October 7th never happens again. And the United States is committed to doing everything we can to support it in those efforts. We've also said that the way Israel does it matters, particularly with regard to civilian protection in Gaza and the provision of humanitarian assistance to Gazans who need it. And we have been working every single day since then, not only to provide Israel with what it needs, but also to do our best to help see that Palestinians get what they need in Gaza. And we see the horrific suffering of children, women, and men who've been caught in a crossfire of Hamas's making for 8 months now. And we are working every day to try to alleviate that. When it comes to the NSM and the use of our weapons, here's what the report said. It said exactly as you quoted. Given the totality of the damage that's been done, and given the fact that we are a major provider of weapons to Israel, it is reasonable to assess that in some instances, Israel has acted in ways that are not consistent with international humanitarian law. And indeed, we are investigating a number of instances, some of which are alluded to in the report, others that are not, to make those determinations. Israel itself is investigating hundreds of incidents to make its own determinations. And indeed, there are criminal investigations underway in Israel in this area. It's very difficult to make final determinations in the midst of a war when we do not have access on the ground, and when you have a almost totally unique battlefield where an enemy, a terrorist organization, Hamas, is hiding behind and underneath civilians in apartment buildings, in mosques, in schools, and firing at the Israeli forces. So we're determined to make every appropriate determination. We're determined that there be no double standard. We have processes at the State Department, including our conventional arms transfer policy, including our
Thank you for your
process that we're
explanation.
engaged in.
I know that it's so complicated that you could go on for a while, but I think you've pointed out the challenge and the fact that assessments are ongoing. I do feel it's important that we approach these questions in NSM 20 with as much integrity as possible. On May 7th, President Biden announced his decision to pause the shipment of the 502,000 bombs. And the following day, he drew a red line stating that, quote, "If Israel goes into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities." And you, Mr. Secretary, reinforced this point when you said, if Israel launches a major military operation into Rafah, then there are systems we're not going to be supporting and supplying for that operation. We are already seeing significant action in Rafah. About 1 million people have fled the city. Is the President going to stand by his red line?
First, the President stands behind the proposition that we will always make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. No one has done more, not only throughout his career, but over the last 8 or so months to make sure that that's the case, and that will continue. At the same time, when it comes to Rafah, we've been very clear in many conversations with Israeli leadership over the past months about our deep concerns about a major military operation in Rafah and the impact that that would have on civilians in Gaza. We insisted that if anything is to go forward, we see a clear, credible plan to get civilians out of harm's way, but not only to get them out of harm's way, to make sure that they're provided for when they're out of harm's way. Now, you mentioned we've seen a very large exodus of people from Rafah, but they are now in places where they don't have the support that they need and that we believe is critical to provide. We also remain very concerned about any major military operation and the impact it would have on the remaining population, given the dense urban environment in Rafah and what we've seen in other places. And so the President's been clear about this with Israel, in public as well as in conversations with others, about the fact that we will not support a major military operation.
Thank you, and that's helpful to understand. I wanted to turn to the issue of providing aid in the situation of the challenge of food and water and medical supplies and so forth. The NSM 20 report noted that action and inaction by Israel contributed significantly to a lack of sustained and predictable delivery of needed assistance at scale, and that the level reaching Palestinian civilians remains insufficient. Insufficient is a very polite way, given that we now have what Cindy McCain has described as full-blown famine in the north, and we're all very aware of the highly stressed conditions in the south as well. As a result of the restrictions that Israel has had in place, we have been urging them, you all have been urging them, and I applaud that, to open more gates, to have a more systematic inspection process so far more trucks per day can get in, to make sure that once the trucks are through the gate, that they can actually get to the warehouses without being attacked or so forth. You've also supported air deliveries by ourselves and by other nations. You've also built a dock. All these things are in response to the restriction of aid. And thus, I was somewhat puzzled that the report concludes we do not assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport and delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. Because it seems like all those actions we're taking, the urging of Israel to do more, and all the other air delivery and docks and so forth are all a response to the restrictions preventing sufficient aid to get in and creating famine conditions affecting a couple million people.
If you could respond briefly.
Yes. First, Senator, there is no doubt that the people of Gaza, children, women, men, are experiencing an acute humanitarian crisis. And food, water, medicine, shelter, all of these things are in severe short supply. And we've been working every single day as well since October 7th to try to make sure that they could get what they need. And we have impressed upon Israel time and again the imperative of really bringing a determined focus to this, not making it an afterthought in the conduct of the war against Hamas, but an absolute priority. They've taken steps over these many months to open access points, going back to October, to have aid go in, but it has not been sufficient by far to meet the need. We saw much more significant progress over the last month or 6 weeks, particularly in the wake of a phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu in early April, where we saw more access points opening. We saw a land route from Jordan being activated. We saw openings in the north, which was critical because aid to North Gaza was particularly deficient. That's improved. But now we've seen, unfortunately, the reverse. Because of the actions in and around Rafah, we see the critical transit points in the south, Rafah Gate itself, as well as Kerem Shalom, until recently being stopped or disrupted, so that the situation in the south now risks being even more egregious. But the restrictions that have been in place, in some cases, it's because of concerns about dual-use items and making sure that Israel could see and verify what was going in, given the history of dual use. In some instances, it's because of the war conditions that make it incredibly difficult, but there are also things that Israel can, should, and must do to further facilitate the distribution of aid, including much more effective deconfliction with those who are providing it. So convoys that are bringing the aid in can go about their work safely and securely. That remains insufficient.
Senator Paul.
Secretary Blinken, on your recent trip to China, news reports came back and said that you reserved your strongest language for China and its dealings with Russia, castigating Beijing for allowing the war to continue in Ukraine. The report went on to describe the exchange as such a blatant dressing down in the Chinese capital. Do you think publicly scolding China will make it more or less likely that they continue selling dual-use parts to Russia?
Senator, we've tried it both ways. We've had these conversations with China from some time in private, hoping to see a change. We haven't seen that, and it's important.
I would argue
Call them out.
I would argue that we've only tried it one way. We've got the stick, and almost the majority of people who work for you, everybody wants to use the stick. Nobody's really considering that there is a carrot. So really, for the last, let's say, 5 years or more, your administration, the previous administration, not a lot different, really, that you put impediments to trade, you add sanctions, and then you scold them. And I mean, there is a school of philosophy or school of diplomacy that believes that public scolding, particularly in another country, can have the opposite effects, that actually you've either completely given up on this, nothing's working, so why don't we just read them the riot act? And that's kind of what it looked like. Yellen was also there recently, and she's described and told the Chinese government how it should run its economy, what sectors of its economy that they should or should not subsidize, and told them as well who they can conduct business with. And then she threatened to impose sanctions, more or less likely to actually get them to do. I mean, I think it's a misunderstanding of diplomacy in general to think that you going and scolding the Chinese, Yellen going and scolding the Chinese, that somehow they're going to go, oh my goodness, we've been wrong all along, and because they've yelled at us and treated us like school children, we're now going to change. I would think that the opposite might be true, that there might be a certain amount of child psychology to criticizing people, and that like a rebellious teenager, they actually might end up doing more. In addition to the threat of sanctions, in addition to the scolding, we now have the administration talking about more tariffs. So in June of 2019, then presidential candidate Joe Biden tweeted, "Trump doesn't get the basics. He thinks his tariffs are being paid for by China. Any freshman econ student would tell you that the American people are paying his tariffs." Remarkably accurate and true at that time, but now he's become jumping on the Trump train. But the thing about tariffs, regardless of who pays them, American consumers will pay for these. Tariffs are not good for the economic well-being of all Americans in general. But the question would become, when you add tariffs, so you're going to threaten sanctions, you're going to scold them, now you're going to add tariffs. More or less likely that they'll do what you want? I think less likely. Everything we're doing, everything the previous administration did, as well as this administration, is heading towards less trade, disengagement from China. Part of diplomacy might be offering, well, I tell you what if you quit selling the dual-use parts to Russia? Maybe we could consider removing some sanctions on trade and actually trade more with you. So the threat of sanctions, the threat of tariffs, actually have some effects if you're willing to remove them. The history of sanctions is more, and then you're not doing enough, and people on the right here will say you got to do even more, we're going to pass legislative sanctions. Nobody talks about removing them, but that's the only way you'd get behavior to change. And so I really think that it's a fundamental misunderstanding sort of what's going on. The final point I would like to make, and I'll let you respond to this, is the Ukrainians still claim that victory includes the reclamation of all of its territory. Many NATO allies are beginning to question this. Czech President Petr Pavel, who once served as the chairman of NATO's military committee, recently stated that he believes it's naive to think that Ukraine will be able to regain the occupied territories from Russia. The commander-in-general of the Ukrainian army, until he was fired by Zelensky, had the same sort of comments. I think that it's not an unreasonable thing to believe that this war may well end in stalemate with people in place. Some say similar to the way Korea was. Nobody likes it, nobody wanted it, nobody agrees the Russians should be there, but they're there and they have a bigger army and more might than their neighbor. So if President Pavel is correct in his assessment that Ukraine's war aims are naive, One of the few negotiating items Ukraine possesses is a promise to remain a neutral country, not aligned militarily, yet you have repeatedly ruled out Ukraine remaining outside of NATO. If you take this off the table, you're taking off one of the things that actually is a negotiating item. My question to you is, are there any circumstances under which neutrality of Ukraine would be a negotiating item?
Thank you, Senator. Let me try to respond to both questions. First, if you want to look at hectoring or haranguing, I would invite you to look at the website of the Chinese Foreign Ministry on a daily basis in terms of what they say about us. Second, I'm not going to apologize to anyone for standing up for American workers and American companies, because here's what we're dealing with. And by the way, of course, you're right, we always try, and as a diplomat, I always try to engage our partners or adversaries diplomatically, quietly, to see if we can get the result. If we don't, then we have to use every means at our disposal, including calling them out. Let me, if I may, please address the question. So on this, what we've seen and what we're seeing now, and this goes to the tariff question, is China very deliberately using overcapacity in critical sectors to export its way out of its current economic troubles, and to do that in a way that undercuts and indeed could gut our own workers and industries. All of that is true,
but my question to you is there an offer ever that you would undo things in exchange for behavior?
Of course, and that goes...
So you want to argue tariffs are good and sanctions are good.
Yeah.
The offer would have to be to say to the government, quietly or otherwise, that we would be willing to go in the opposite direction.
Of course.
There's no public, I hear no public discussion, not from Congress and not from anyone in the administration.
Senator,
we would undo this if this.
Senator, on their own terms, it's clear that if the conduct that we object to and that risks terrible damage to our workers, to our communities, to our companies, if they change that conduct, of course.
Did you specifically discuss not having tariffs or undoing sanctions in exchange for the Chinese to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia?
In the context, sure, if their companies don't engage in that practice, we're not going to sanction them.
I didn't hear any public statements of that. Did you make private statements to President Xi that you would undo trade sanctions and not put on tariffs in exchange for better behavior towards Russia?
By definition, if they don't engage in the conduct that we object to, then we're not going to be using those tariffs or using those sanctions.
But this sounds like me drawing this out of you. It doesn't sound to me like this is the kind of diplomacy that's occurring. If you want it to occur, you have to have a little different conception of you've got the stick. The whole problem with diplomacy in this country, not just your administration, but the previous, is all you see is the stick, all you see is more sanctions. And if I ask you to tell me what has China done to change its behavior based on your sanctions, to change their behavior for the better, I would say you can't come up with anything China's doing. Everything seems to be the wrong direction. That's your interpretation. Everything's the wrong direction.
No, we've actually
so the sanctions really are not having a value unless you want to negotiate removing sanctions to get better behavior.